Let's get to Margaret Brennan. She is at the G20 summit. She was there listening to President Obama and asked him a question about what the president intends to do to continue to destroy and to degrade ISIS. Margaret, the president seemingly starting to get annoyed at the end with reporters who kept pressing him for specific responses to exactly how he plans on not only destroying ISIS there in Syria and in Iraq, but also protecting Americans and her allies here in the homeland.
That's right, Vlad. I mean, the president has come under fire in recent days, with the world really maybe expecting a shift in strategy to respond to what appears to be a new front, with ISIS now able to launch multiple attacks in Europe and, as the president said, be undetected by intelligence agencies when they carried that out. But the president said that does not mean they're more sophisticated. He said we knew they could launch attacks. He said we have not underestimated them. And he really delivered a long defense of his strategy up to this point and said, we're staying the course. We're not going to change direction because of this attack in Paris. What we do know is that the president had already previously authorized some ramping up of bombings, some ramping up of raids with those special forces recently being deployed. But what you heard today was President Obama in some ways on the defensive, saying, stick with me, this is the course we're going to have, and any of those who are criticizing me on the campaign trail, we made a few oblique mentions there, really don't know what it is like to carry out this kind of campaign against a nihilistic group who really isn't a conventional warfare type model. And he said, you know, he'd challenge anyone to talk to his chiefs of staff and come up with a more accurate read of the ground.
Margaret, in addition to the comments about the military campaign, it was also interesting to hear him talk about the refugees, that nothing would change regarding the U.S. accepting and continuing to accept Syrian refugees. Tell us about that.
You're right, Elaine. It was really interesting here because there were 2 points on which the president showed some emotion. One of them was talking about seeing U.S. vets in Walter Reed who have been injured in combat. And the other, he was very, very impassioned in defending the U.S. policy of accepting refugees. He pointed out that refugees, when they are fleeing Syria, when they are fleeing ISIS, when they're fleeing this conflict, are some of the most desperate and in need of help and in aid. He called it un-American to question whether refugees should be accepted into the U.S., specifically when it comes to determining whether they're Christian or Muslim, as you have heard some in the political classes sort of chatter about in the past few days. Should there be a religious test? President Obama said that is un-American. That is not what we do. We need to be opening up our arms here, pointing out as well a very sensitive topic back in the U.S., which is whether or not there is something perhaps fundamentally within Islam that the U.S. is at war with. He said absolutely not. If there are refugees who are Muslim, that shouldn't matter. You should accept them into the United States. And he really praised German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who has accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees. But it was also interesting, though, while he struck that emotional point, he flat out refused and took off the table the idea of creating a safe zone to protect those refugees, which so many have said if you help people stay in the region, if you give them a reason to feel safe enough to stay in Syria, you won't have them spilling into the Middle East. You won't have them fleeing to Europe, and that'll solve your problem. The president says he's looked at that option. It's not going to work, and he's not going to launch one. The U.S. is just not going to provide that kind of protection for refugees in the region.
Margaret, I want to ask you a question on the geopolitical stage there. During the last half hour or so, the Elysee Palace, which is the equivalent of the White House in France, tweeted out that Francois Hollande will be meeting with President Obama in Washington and Vladimir Putin in Moscow. The president, during his remarks, said that now there appears to be a framework, an agreement between these world leaders, these allies, on how to deal with the question of Syria and specifically ISIS. And the president also saying we do not envision a future in Syria for Bashar al-Assad. But what has happened in France on Friday, are we going to see a coalescing amongst these three leaders now about what to do with ISIS? In other words, we'd seen Putin and Obama at loggerheads. Is this going to change that?
Vlad, it's a huge question. I mean, you basically laid out at the massive chessboard that is the question of how to defeat ISIS and the many conflicts that overlap here. What was interesting in what the president said is he really put his shoulder behind what is a very risky bet, which is that you can get all sides in the Syrian war to lay down their arms to declare a ceasefire and honor it. The goal here of the Obama administration, and this is a key cornerstone of the policy to defeat ISIS, is that if they can get the fighting in Syria to stop, it will no longer become a safe haven for ISIS. And so that is why it's key for the president to be leaning on Russia's Vladimir Putin to say, bring Bashar al-Assad to the negotiating table. The harder part of that equation is really for the United States, its allies in France and elsewhere, including Saudi Arabia. It's going to be up to them to wrangle the Syrian opposition, which has been very divided, which hasn't necessarily accepted this idea of a ceasefire just yet. And you have to get all of these armed groups to sit down and talk to each other. The idea is if you can get any kind of ceasefire there, eventually you might be able to get everyone else to point their guns in the same direction against ISIS. But this, while the goal is to have a ceasefire by January 1st, it is incredibly risky. It is incredibly uncertain if it can get done. But it's going to be up to John Kerry, who's negotiating with Iran and with Russia and with all the Arab allies to try to get this under control.
Margaret Brennan there in Turkey following the president as he is at the G20 summit. Margaret, we appreciate it. Thank you.